Hello everyone and welcome back to Ushanka Show, stories about life in the Soviet Union. In today's video we're gonna talk about trucking in the USSR. I had several of my subscribers that kept on asking me to do something on the topic of Soviet trucking, Soviet long distance trucking, so here we are. And we'll start with a short lesson of the Russian language. Урок русского языка. Грузовик. Грузовик. That's how we say truck in Russian language. Грузовик. Грузовые перевозки. Грузовые перевозки. That's how the trucking could be translated into Russian. We don't have a single word. Грузовые перевозки. Водитель. Водитель. A driver. Водитель. And the professional drivers were called шофер. Шофер. That's similar to the English word chauffeur, or it probably came originally from the French language. Шофер. So every шофер is a водитель, but not every водитель is a шофер. And now let's talk about грузовые перевозки. Let's talk about trucking in the Soviet Union. But before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that my family never owned a vehicle, and we never even thought about trying to buy a car. So I had zero experience driving neither truck nor car in the Soviet Union. And it's also important to remember that in Soviet Union, people weren't allowed to own the trucks. I guess it was considered means of production in some way. So people could own cars, motorcycles, no trucks, and no minivans. And I also need to mention that we really didn't have pickup trucks in the Soviet Union, and even the word pickup didn't exist in the Russian language. It was just borrowed from English, so we say pickup. But I found photos of some sweet looking pickup trucks based on the old Soviet trucks, like this Black Beauty is based on GAZ-51 and Cadillac Escalade. And here's another custom Gaz pickup truck. I think it looks pretty sweet. And look at this mean looking ZIL, Z-I-L pickup truck. That looks sweet. So being a truck driver, chauffeur in the Soviet Union was a pretty sweet gig. Not because of the salary, of course, but because you had access to free gasoline, engine oil, and it could also provide services like moving services or other services that you can bring somebody sand or rocks or bring a refrigerator that person purchased in the store. So the drivers usually were doing pretty well. For example, my grandpa owned this moped called Verkhovina 5, and I'm planning to make a video about it. So the closest gas station to our village was about 30 kilometers away. So of course that will be pretty stupid riding 60 kilometers round trip to fill up the tank. And of course my grandpa never had to do that because we had a collective farm in our village, and the collective farm had probably about 5 trucks. And that's where my grandpa was getting gasoline. He would ride the moped to one of his buddies' truck drivers, and in exchange for moonshine or cash, he would fill up his tank with free collective farm gasoline. And I don't remember my grandpa ever buying engine oil to mix with the gasoline for that moped engine. The oil probably also came from the same source, from the collective farm driver. Over the years, I posted quite a few photos on my YouTube community page where I showed happy Soviet people moving into their new apartment buildings. And you may notice they use all kind of random trucks. So there's not professional movers. It's just whoever you knew, whoever you can make a deal. Hey, do you mind middle of the day swing by our apartment, load up the stuff and move to our new apartment? And that's how people usually move. When it was time for my family to move, and it happened in 1980, we had actually even more extreme case of moving, because my father managed only to find a bus to do the move. So we had this LIAZ city bus that we put all our stuff in, and granted, we moved from one small room apartment, so we didn't have much stuff, and we moved to our 3-room apartment. But yeah, we had everything loaded on the bus, and I remember that day really well. I was in charge of keeping an eye on our big cactus plant. My mom was afraid it will tip and break, so I was holding this cactus with one hand, and I was just amazed, because when you always use public transportation, you inhabit to stop every so often at the bus stops, and you know what those bus stops. So when our bus was just flying by and never stopping. It felt so cool, and I remember seeing those angry faces of people on the bus stops because they thought it's their bus approaching, and then we just drove by without stopping. So yeah, my family moved using a regular city bus. When I was gathering information for this video, I thought about it and I realized, wait a minute, in 20 years of my life in the Soviet Union, I never rode a Soviet truck. I never was in a cab, except one time when I came to my dad's factory and they were repainting Ural military trucks, and that was the only time I was inside of the truck and I was, pulling the air horn, and that's it. Otherwise, I never rode inside of the Soviet truck. There were several so-called workhorses of the Soviet trucking, and when I thought about it, it's kind of interesting. I remember only GAZ trucks out in the country and more ZIL trucks out in the cities, at least in Ukraine. I remember a lot of GAZ-51 trucks. Those were 2.5 ton trucks manufactured between 1946 and guess what? 1975. So they were manufactured in the Soviet Union for 29 years with approximately 3.5 million trucks manufactured in those 29 years. GAZ-51 trucks used straight 6 engine, which was licensed from Dodge, and that engine was originally designed back in 1937. So all the way until 1975, they used that ancient engine, and it's 3.5 liter with 70 horsepower. Another popular truck on the Soviet roads, and I mean popular because it was just manufactured in such a large quantities, was GAZ-53. This one was manufactured between 1961 and 1993 for 32 years. This truck was a little bit more heavy duty and had a V8 engine, and it was a 3-ton truck, and around 4 million of those was manufactured. Another popular truck on the Soviet roads was ZIL 130, and it looks very similar to GAZ-53. As a kid, I had this strange hobby. I used to like to write down unusual license plates, and I remember confusing ZIL with GAZ because their fronts are very similar, and it took me a while to kind of finally figure out which one was ZIL and which one was GAZ. Anyway, ZIL 130 was manufactured between 1962 and 1994 for 32 years, so it looks like it's a normal production cycle for Soviet trucks, around 30 years. About 3.5 million of them were produced, so this truck was a little bit more heavy duty. It had 5 to 6 ton capacity, and it had a V8 with 150 horsepower engine. So these trucks, ZIL and GAZ, were pretty much everywhere, and they did the majority of local deliveries, bringing, for example, bread from the bakeries to the grocery stores. The collective farms, kolkhozy, and the Soviet farms, sovkhozy, used these trucks extensively for harvesting and all kinds of other farming tasks. ZIL 130, since it was the most powerful small truck, it was used extensively as a dump truck. And of course, there were many other modifications, street sweepers, tankers to deliver milk or fuel or live fish, trash collectors, and so on and so on. And I don't recall any semi-truck style trailers doing any local deliveries. And I'm planning to make a separate video about long distance trucking and Sovtransavto, but generally there were not many semi-trucks on the Soviet roads, and that's one of the reasons I loved movie Convoy so much. And for those who have no idea what I'm talking about a 1978 American movie Convoy starring Chris Christopherson, and it's a movie about American truckers. This movie did okay in American theaters with about 9.7 million tickets sold. Meanwhile, when it was shown in the Soviet Union sometimes in 1984, I believe, 36 million people went to watch that movie. I went twice as many as my friends, and I think that movie in top 10 top grossing movie in the Soviet Union ever, even though it was an American film. After watching The Convoy, I fell in love with American big rigs, and when I arrived to the US back in the summer of 1995, I was so happy to take a photo standing next to American semi-trucks. And I was extremely lucky because one of the Americans that I met during my first summer here in Michigan, there was Richard, who was a truck driver, and in the fall of 1995 he invited me for a truck trip. So I went from Michigan down to Indiana with the load of frozen cherries, and that was one of the best days of my life. And if you're interested to learn more about my adventures in America back in the summer of 1995 and 1996, I have 2 books available, American Diaries 1995 and American Diaries 1996, which are available on my site, Sputnikov.com, as well as on Amazon. Okay, I believe it's a good spot to stop right here, and on my next video we'll talk about long distance trucking in the Soviet Union, and we'll talk about Sovtransavto. And once again, thank you so much for watching Ushanka Show. I hope you enjoyed this video, maybe learned something new, and we'll talk to you soon. До свидания, goodbye.